Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. I'm joined by my friend Justin Mooney. We're actually at a philosophy of religion workshop, and Justin just presented his paper on the Non-Consequentialist Argument from Evil earlier today. So we're going to try and summarize in about 30 minutes what he discusses in that paper. So thanks for coming on, Justin.
Yeah, I am excited to be here. I'm wearing my TAC swag, which everyone should get. Yeah, cool. Let's do this.
All right, so this paper is called the Non-Consequentialist Argument from Evil. First, what do you mean by non-consequentialism?
Yeah. So non-consequential, well, actually, here's a good way to explain it. So consequentialism is a view, an ethical theory that says that basically when it comes to like whether an action is right or wrong morally, the only thing that matters is the consequences of the action. And then non-consequentialism is the denial of that view. It says consequences are not the only thing that matters when it comes to settling whether an action is right or wrong. Other things might matter too, like maybe the agent's intentions or maybe the kind of action that's being performed, something like that. You know?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So now give us the summary of this argument, the non-consequentialist argument from evil.
Yeah. Okay, so this is like an aspect of the problem of evil, right? The problem of evil is this huge, complicated thing where there's a bunch of different sides to it. One aspect of the problem of evil has to do with this idea that there are non-consequentialist constraints on permitting evil, meaning that there are like moral rules that say you can't permit this evil even if it would have good consequences. Okay? And so here's the problem that this poses for someone who believes in like a God who's like all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, right? So we already know there's a problem about, well, why would that God permit, like evil and suffering in the world, right? And one of the most common strategies for answering this problem is to say, well, there's one or more greater goods that God is trying to bring about, and that require evils, or at least require that God like permit there to be evils or something like that. And that's already difficult. Like, it's already difficult to try to identify greater goods like that an all-knowing, all-powerful God could only bring about by permitting evils like the ones in our world, right? But if there are also non-consequentialist constraints on permitting evil, these like moral rules that say you can't do it even if it would have good consequences, that makes the project even harder, because now in addition to trying to find these like suitable greater goods, you also have to like be careful to try to circumnavigate all of these constraints on bringing about greater goods.
Right.
Yeah. And so you might like sort of like despair of like, well, how could maybe there's just no way to do it, right? Maybe this is just too hard of a project, so there's no way we're going to come up with a successful theory about why God permits the evils in the world. Yeah. So that's roughly the problem.
Yeah, okay. So in the paper, you talk about two types of constraints. There are these negative side constraints and positive side constraints. So what do you mean by negative side constraints? And just talk us through what those would be.
Yeah. So we should mention side constraint means the same thing as non-consequentialist constraint. And that's just a shorter word for it.
Yeah.
Okay. So we talk about, so there's a philosopher named Philip Foot who introduced this distinction between negative and positive duties. And so when we're thinking about evil, negative duties are duties not to do evil, and positive duties are duties not to allow evil. So negative duties forbid you from doing certain things, and then positive duties require you to do certain, like to intervene and stop an evil. All right. And so negative and positive side constraints is just that distinction applied to these side constraints we're talking about. So there are negative side constraints, which are like, you can't do this evil even if it would have good consequences. And there are positive side constraints, which means you can't allow this evil even if it would have good consequences.
Yeah.
That
okay.
kind of makes sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's what they are. So in terms of, I think you got a couple of cases for us to think about when it comes to negative side constraints. So maybe the creation button case? Set this one up for us.
Right. Okay, so what I want to try to do is answer this challenge about like okay, can God sort of permit the evils in the world without violating these side constraints, right? And I want to say, yes, God can do that. And so so we'll start with negative side constraints, like you said, right? So here's a case that I found sort of helpful to think about. I call it the creation button case. And actually, you mind if I just read?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, here's the case. All right. Suppose you possess a creation button. Pressing the button will cause a big bang that unfolds over time into a universe much like ours, where organisms, and ultimately creatures like us, eventually evolve on some suitable planet where they experience approximately the same kinds, amounts, and distributions of good and evil that we do on Earth. So causally downstream of pressing the button, there will be earthquakes, diseases, and predation, but also stars, coral reefs, rainforests, and communities of people. There will be many wars, kidnappings, and murders, but also a lot of love, virtue, and music. Okay, that's the creation button case. Here's the question that I want to think about. Is it permissible to press the creation button? And my intuition about this is, yes, it seems like it is permissible to press that button. That wouldn't be like a morally wrong thing for me to do. I could press that button, that would cause this universe to come into existence, right? But what's interesting about that is if I press that button, in the long run, I'm causing a ton of like horrible evils because that universe is one like ours, and there's a lot of horrible evils in our universe, right? And so it seems like if there are any side constraints on doing evil, you might wonder like, well, why wouldn't this be violating any of those side constraints? Now, of course, you might say that there just aren't any, and some people have that view, right? That's not my view. I think that there are some negative side constraints. Like, I think it's not okay to torture a child, even if that would somehow lead to like significant soul making later in that child's life, right? Mm-hmm. Right. But then why is it okay to press the creation button? Because that's going to cause people to be tortured eventually, right? That's going to happen. And all right. So here's what I think is going on. I think it has to do with the nature of the causal connection between pressing the button and each of the individual evils that results. Mm-hmm. All right. So there's a weird, like, kind of indirect causal connection here. It's very hard to specify exactly what it is about the causal, like the kind of indirectness that's relevant here. So I've just kind of introduced a name for it. I call it improper mediation. So I want to say, hey, the causal connection between pressing the button and each of the evils that results is an improperly mediated causal connection. So it might help if I give some like more mundane examples of this. Okay, so here's one. Consider this case. Suppose I introduce two of my friends to each other and they end up falling in love and getting married and having a child named Sally. Okay. Sally lives a good life and eventually dies of natural causes. Okay, so at least on some theories of causation, I cause Sally's death because I caused the parents, or these two friends to meet, which was part of the cause of them getting married, which was part of the cause of them having a kid, and the kid coming into existence. If that hadn't happened, the kid would never have died, right? Okay. But I don't think I've killed Sally, right?
You caused Sally's death, but you did not kill Sally.
Yeah, so not every causing of a death is a killing.
You're right.
Is what that kind of case suggests, right? Similarly, David Lewis says, here's a quote from Lewis. He says, "Consider the Big Bang. This event, I take it, is a cause of every later event without exception. Then it is a cause of every death. But the Big Bang did not kill anyone." Mm-hmm. Okay, another example where it seems like, look, you've got a case of something causing a death, but it's not a case of killing. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then Lewis actually suggests that this is like a general phenomenon. Like when you have these like weirdly indirect causal connections between an action or some event and like some consequence like an evil, those they don't qualify as ordinary kinds of actions like killing or torturing or abusing, right? Ordinary sorts of actions seem to require a suitably direct causal connection. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now I'm being loose here, like what does direct mean and like what kind of directness? I don't actually know. It seems like this phenomenon is real. Like it really is true that Actually, so I was talking to Trenton Merricks earlier. He was at the conference, and he gave me this suggestion. He says, look, what matters is that, like, there are certain paradigm cases of this phenomenon that I call improper mediation. And I only need the paradigm cases to say what I want to say. Mm-hmm. So we don't need to figure out exactly what it takes to be, Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I want to say in the creation button case, this is a paradigm case of improper mediation. Every case of, like, the causal connection between pressing the button and, like, some evil in the resulting universe is one of these improperly mediated chains. So if you press the button, even though you're causing deaths and abuses and torturings, you are not killing, abusing, and torturing, etc.
Okay.
And then what I want to say is something like this, that all the negative side constraints that there are constraints on those kinds of actions, on killing, abusing, torturing, etc. Mm-hmm. And so since you're not doing any of those, you're not violating any negative side constraints.
Now all that applies in the case of this creation button, like God bringing something in and these are the effects of his causing those things to come to be.
Because I want to say the creation button is like God creating the world.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
But God not only creates the world, he also sustains it.
Yeah.
So how do we think about, does his sustaining these things violate negative side constraints?
Yeah, good. So I have another version of the button case for sustaining, right? And the idea is, like, okay, suppose that after you hit the creation button, you actually have to hold down a conservation button, and that keeps the laws of nature running. And so as long as you hold it down, the universe will keep going like normal, right? And then if you let go of that button, then the universe just, like, stops or something like that. Okay. And now suppose that you're holding down this button and, like, some horrendous evil is occurring, like some child is being tortured, right? Okay. And suppose you can interfere and stop that child from being tortured without letting up on the button. You could keep holding the button the whole time. You're good, but you could still rescue that child. All right. So it seems to me, my intuition about this is I ought to intervene. I ought to stop the child from being tortured. But I also have this intuition that if I don't intervene, I'm only allowing evil. I'm allowing the child to be tortured. I'm not torturing the child. Like, I'm not a co-torturer along with whoever, right? Just because I'm holding down the conservation button, okay? And I think there's a way to make sense of that intuition. And it has to do with, like, what's the difference between doing and allowing? Well, this is, like, super controversial. There's a bunch of theories about what the difference between doing and allowing is. But one of those theories says that in order to do an evil rather than allow it, the causal connection between what you do and the evil has to be a chain of what a certain author calls, it's Fiona Woolard, calls substantial facts. And her intuitive, like, rough gloss on what a substantial fact is it's got to be a change or addition to the world and not like an absence or an omission or something like that, okay? So here's what I want to say. I want to say maybe facts about the continuing operation of the laws of nature are non-substantial facts. Right now, Fiona Woolard doesn't say that, but I'm suggesting let's add that to the list of non-substantial facts because it's kind of in the spirit of her view. There's a sense in which the continuing operation of the laws of nature, that's not a change or addition to the world. It's like the cosmic status quo, Okay, and so I'm thinking, suppose we do that. Well, then that makes sense of my intuition about the conservation button case because the causal connection between me holding down this button and this child being tortured runs through, like, one of the facts that connects them is this fact about the continuing operation of the laws, and that's not a substantial fact. So on this account of doing and allowing, it's going to turn out to be an allowing of evil rather than a doing of evil. And then I just want to say same thing with God, because we could just say, look, God sustains the world by willing that the laws of nature continue to operate. And so all of God's sustaining activity, even though it causes, it's part of the cause of, like, the evils that happen, the causal connection has this non-substantial fact in it about the laws of nature.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so all of that concerns negative side constraints.
Right.
But now let's turn to the positive side constraints.
Yeah.
And remind us one more time what the
that
positive is and walk us through those examples.
Yeah. Okay. So positive side constraints, those were side constraints on allowing evil. So since they're side constraints, it's like you can't allow this evil even if it would have like really good consequences, is the idea roughly.
Okay.
So I think there are positive side constraints on some evils. Like, I think I shouldn't allow a child to be tortured even if somehow I knew, oh, this is going to result in like soul making later, right? Now, not everybody's going to agree about that, but that's a view that I hold. Now, can God create and sustain the world without violating any of those? Well, I think in the case of creation, I think this is kind of an easy case, because I think that when God creates the world, if that causes evils to happen later, like in the creation button case, right, where the button causes evils, right, then I think I'm inclined to think, to put it in a way that some other authors have put it, talking about other things, that this falls on the doing side of the doing allowing line. Uh-huh. And so this is the positive side constraints just aren't relevant in the case of creation. And so there's no way that God in creating the world is violating any positive side constraints, right?
Okay.
I have another thought about that I'm going to skip over for the sake of time. But so I have like a backup response to this one. But I just think, look, that's a doing of evil. It's not an ordinary it's not like a killing, like we talked about earlier, like killing, torturing. But it is a doing rather than an allowing. And so positive side constraints are just a non-issue here.
I see.
Yeah. Okay, but the tough case is, what about God conserving the world again, right?
Yeah.
And then, like, so I've already said, like, if you're holding down the conservation button and there's a child being tortured over here, you ought to intervene, right? Like, you might, even if you don't, you're only allowing the child to suffer, I've suggested. But still, you should intervene. You should not allow the child to suffer. And moreover, I think that is a side constraint. I think even if, some really good consequences come for this or whatever, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't allow the child to suffer. Okay, so what do I do about this case? All right, so I have kind of a very speculative, but I think sort of cool idea about this. Maybe you'll agree, maybe you will. So I actually think that morality is not nearly as demanding as it could be. It doesn't require us to constantly be doing everything we can to alleviate suffering and evil around the world. Instead, it leaves us with the freedom to pursue personal projects of various sorts, right? And that's something that most of us, in fact, do, and we think that's permissible. We think, yeah, we can, we don't have to all the time be alleviating suffering, even though there is suffering going on all the time, right? Okay. So Fiona Woolard has a theory about why morality is like that. And her theory is basically like, hey, look, what's going on here is that it's a significant fact that we are like intimately related to our bodies, right? Our bodies are like the locus of our agency and perception of the world and so forth. And so morality is kind of like respecting that. It's sort of saying like, look, because you are intimately related to your body and so forth, right? You should have this freedom to, within certain limits, to kind of do what you want with your body. It's yours. Okay. And so this is like and I think Fiona Woolard puts it in terms of like morality respecting us. I think that's kind of a metaphor. The literal truth, on my view, would be more like, well, it's fitting, given the way we're related to our bodies, that morality give us some freedom with how we use our bodies, right? So facts about fittingness, which that's a whole other discussion. Anyway. I want to say, though, that something similar is true about God. My suggestion is that morality is limited with respect to the demands it places on God on like how to run the world, in particular, and intervening in the world. And it's limited this way because the world, because of the way the world is related to God. The world, I think, is like radically dependent on God, and that, I think, is a really significant fact. And morality like respects that by like giving God the freedom to run the world as God pleases, so to speak, rather than requiring that God run it this way or that way or like interfere all the time. Okay.
Yeah.
And so one way of thinking about it is like, morality, if morality were super demanding with respect to God, it would be treating God too much like just another agent in the world, rather than like the foundational agent who,
right.
Yeah, something like that. And again, like the respecting stuff, like morality is respecting this fact about God, or respecting God is kind of metaphorical, I think. The literal truth would be something more like, well, it's fitting, given the way that God is related to the world, that morality wouldn't require God to interfere in certain ways, right?
Yeah.
And then just to make this a little bit more detailed, to what extent and in what way are the demands on God's interference limited? And here's my thought about this. Again, this is all pretty speculative, but I think it's got some plausibility to it. I want to say morality does not require God to interfere miraculously in the world at all. And I think that there's a couple of things that can be said in favor of this. One is, it seems like allowing God to just sort of run the world according to the laws of nature that God has chosen to be like, this is the kind of world, this is how it's supposed to work. That just seems fitting to me. Like, if we're looking for some place to draw a line like this, that seems like a great place. Like, it just makes sense.
Yeah.
And then also, I think it's extreme to say, oh, God doesn't have to intervene at all. But I think that that's kind of fitting too, because the dependence of the world on God is extreme. And this limitation of morality is supposed to be like reflecting that in some way, or respecting that, or whatever, right? Okay, so that's my thought. That was kind of like a quick run through.
Yeah.
Is anything like unclear, or do you have
No.
like objections, or I don't know?
So during the workshop, lots of objections got raised.
Yeah,
It's a good discussion.
Yeah.
But I think we'll leave it there. Maybe what you can do before we end is just summarize this, like conclude it for us. Give us the summary.
Yeah, okay, yeah, good, right. So the summary is like, hey, look, it seems like there's this problem for the project of like trying to figure out why God permits the evil in the world. The problem is that you might think, I certainly think, that there are these like moral rules that say, hey, you can't permit evils sometimes even when they would have really good consequences. Mm-hmm. All right. Now, if you're the kind of person who thinks there are moral rules like that, then you're going to have to worry about like, well, how does God get around all of those? Is that even possible? Or is God going to be like running afoul of these moral rules when God allows evil stuff to happen? And so what I've done is I've tried to spell out a story about how God could get around how God could permit the evils in the world without violating any of those rules. Not denying that the rules are there, just saying, look, God can get around them, right? And so we considered two different kinds, the negative side constraints, the positive ones. And basically in both cases I've said, well, think about like the unique way in which God is related to the world. And I've used something about that to try to get around it.
It was super interesting, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Thanks, Justin, for joining me.
Yeah.
All right, check out Justin's other interviews that I've done. He's done one on middle knowledge and another on the Trinity. So check those out. All right, see you guys later.